All right, everybody, we're going to go ahead and get started. Before we launch into the PowerPoint, I just wanted to give you guys a reminder, this is a brand new platform for us, and one that has a couple of quirks to it, the biggest one being a 40-minute limit on all presentations before it kicks us off the line. We will address a couple minutes beforehand if we're coming close to that, but I think that this is a short presentation. Everyone on the line is muted right now, but you have all been given the power to unmute yourselves. So feel free to jump in just like you would during an in-person MedServ lecture with any questions along the way, and we'll have some time for questions at the end as well. So jumping now into the presentation, Story of Self is a model that actually has nothing to do with writing AMCAS or CASPA essays or actually anything to do with medicine. It comes from the world of community organizing. But what I really like about it is that it is geared towards and kind of starts from a place of helping people get to know you and what you care about, and translating that into having and sort of forming a shared vision with another person, which I think translates nicely to helping someone understand the difference that you want to make and getting them on board to help you make that difference. And in the very narrow way that we want someone to help each of you is by helping you continue on to the next step of your education. So today we actually got to talk a little bit about the AMCAS and CASPA applications at Summit in person. So I'm going to focus most of our attention today, given our limited time frame, on the Story of Self framework. And we are not, just to let you know, because of the change in format, going to necessarily do the brainstorming portion of this lecture virtually, but there will be a session at the Charlotte Summit in April that will allow you some time to brainstorm. And this is actually a nice way to give you some time to mull over how you might put this model to use. So the important thing, I think, to understand, all of this is repeat information about these general applications, but the important thing to understand about AMCAS and CASPA is that there's a little bit of a waiting game until these application portals open. And the personal statement is something that you can think about in advance and have some time to really craft your story, and you don't necessarily have to rush to complete it when these applications are actually open, which is sort of how things like secondary applications will work later in the process. But this is one thing there you can really think about the story that you want to tell and have some time to get that story right. There are some common kind of questions that the personal statement is expected to answer. One is why a career in healthcare? And it is really, really short. So if you think that it's hard to condense a reflective writing piece down into a page or two, this is about a page to explain why you want to go into the field that you want to go into, and convince someone that they know you really well. It's a personal statement to do that. You have some opportunities to do in supplemental sections to sort of explain and give evidence of why you want to do that, but I want you to understand that the personal statement is a short space and to really convince someone that they know you and where you're headed. So that's where I think the Story of Self is really helpful. And we're going to jump into that now. I think one thing that I found confusing when I was starting to work with the Story of Self model is that it's really one model with two different models inside it. The model that some of you might have heard of that is really at the heart of Story of Self is the Self, Us, Now model. And we'll go in a minute into what that means. But there is a second model within the Story of Self of choice, challenge, and outcome. And the way that I would think about these two models, the self, us, now model is kind of how the overall story of self is structured. So it is your primary model, your primary way of delivering your story of self. The choice, challenge, outcomes is how you can complicate the story and how you can make the story a little bit grittier and more real than sometimes self, us, now stories can come off. And that will make more sense when we dive in a minute, but I just want you to start to think about how those two overlap. So the story of self and the self, us, now model, it starts with self. And I think that this is something that, especially in healthcare and for service-oriented people, is a really hard place for people to start. But the story of self kind of writing framework asks the writer to first let the reader or the person listening to this story know something very personal and fundamental about you as an individual. So whatever this story is, it gives the reader a sense of who you are as a person first. In the us section of a story of self, you expand from that individual, very sometimes very small, very personal portrait of self to bring in a broader audience and kind of help people understand the breadth or broaden out your personal experience. So if your self story is about the curiosity you had as a young kid, or the way that you first discovered service, the us portion is a chance for you to talk about all of the ways that you've developed that or broadened it. Maybe med service part of that, maybe it's a description of many of the different patients that you have met that help exemplify that, or even sometimes statistics can help exemplify that. And then the now section of the story of self is your call to arms. So in social organizing, this is the cause of the day or the message that a social organizer is trying to rally a crowd around. And that might be an odd way to think about your personal statement, but if you'll follow me through that odd thought, the call to arms really is what you're trying to convince someone else. And in the personal statement, that really is: bring me to your medical school, bring me to your PA school, give me a chance to join the healthcare community. And that is that's what you're trying to convey. It is your personal statement of why you as an individual are called to do this work. So the second model, first of all, I'll pause and see if there are any questions just about self, us, and now. Okay. So a lot of self, us, now stories, especially when they're applied to healthcare and to sort of health profession school applications, can sound very reaffirming in a way that isn't always a good thing. So for example, you might say, I always knew I was a service-oriented person, and here is my personal example of something deep in my life or very fundamental to me that conveys that. And then moving into the us section might talk about all of the service activities that that individual has done in college and through something like MedServ, all as kind of evidence of this long-standing interest in who that person fundamentally is. All culminating in the kind of call to arms of, I am ready to join the healthcare profession as a member of a medical school or physician assistant school class, because this is the natural outcome of all of these wonderful things that I have been involved in. And that is fine. And that is a lot of, it's a lot of personal statements for health professions schools. But it can come off as sort of self-reinforcing, that you knew this great thing about yourself and then you went out and affirmed that great thing, and now you want us to buy in and to believe this that you are such a great candidate for a medical school or physician assistant school. And one way that you can kind of complicate that picture is with the challenge, choice, outcome kind of layer to the story of self. So one of the things that can be really helpful to show across the story of self is how you are growing and adding skills and working towards this future self of being a healthcare provider. And I think challenge, choice, outcome helps you show growth inside the essay. So challenge helps you think about not in all of the world, bigger world and universe of stories about you that convey something that is fundamentally you or very personal to you. There are some stories that that are less complicated and some that are more complicated, and often a good place to start is a challenge story. That, and the hypothesis is that these stories in particular are very relatable. That sometimes it is tough moments and growth moments that really make us the people that we are, and that is something that a reader of an essay, it's just a little bit of an easier way to get to know you as an individual and to feel like in a very short space, remember our one-page space, someone is learning and gathering a lot of insight packed into a very small space. So weaving that into that idea of challenge into your personal statement can be very helpful, and especially into your story of self can be very helpful. The way that I think that, so the next step of the challenge, choice, and outcome model is choice. And the way that I would think about this is for the challenge that you present, or for the growth moment that you may present in your story of self, how can you describe to someone the way that you acted on that challenge presented to you? And sometimes this might come in the self portion of the story of self, and sometimes it may come in the us portion as you're talking about some of the ways that you have broadened that perspective. That again shows you as an active entity that are building these skills, working towards this goal that you want to convince your reader you can achieve. And it helps to present a very active and again kind of self-focused, but that's the goal of this, is to show someone how you have acted on challenges or sort of elements that are presented in your story of self. And then of course you want to show someone the outcome and the results of the choices that you've made. And in particular in the us section of the story of self, these outcomes can help show your reader in a very small space how you're learning and growing and working towards building a perspective on healthcare that they can look at and with a page in front of them say, this is someone that I want to join my institution. Okay. So we're not going to do individual brainstorms, but I wanted to walk you through. Sorry guys. I wanted to walk you through an example of the story of self. And I just want to reassure you that the example does not have to be dramatic. You don't have to, and sometimes it might be, and that might reflect your personal experience. And if so, that's great. That's great fodder. And sharing that is really helpful in people getting to know you and wanting to invest in you. But I thought I would walk through a model a model story of that's kind of a common example um, from social organizing that I think can show you some of these pieces in action. So, and I apologize, I'm not going to read the full story because I think it's silly for me to read at you, but I'll walk you through the components of the story and kind of how they fit in the model. So the story comes from an urban environmental sort of worker who was the leader of a nonprofit organization that tried to increase garden space in underserved areas in urban communities. And she was trying to share her passion for that particular issue using the story of self model. And the way that she actually started that story had nothing to do with the environment, had nothing to do with the people she was serving or any stories about them, but was actually a story from her childhood where she described growing up in New York City, where her mother would clean homes and how she would go with her mother and kind of occupy these spaces that were not her own. And how, as she grew older, she began to realize that she wasn't going over to these homes to play, and that these spaces were not hers, but that her mom had tasks to do there, that she was there to sort of accompany her through, and that that kind of self story is something that she then broadened out in the us section of the story of self to talk about the impact that understanding that loss of control over space, and realizing that some people had access to beautiful spaces while others did not, that broader issue came to light through many experiences that she had had in her childhood and as an adult that were similar to that, and she would talk then about more about the neighborhood in which she grew up and the way that the landscape around her created disadvantage for her neighbors. And she would talk about the various communities that she served through her nonprofit organization, and how loss of autonomy over certain spaces created disadvantage for those communities. So taking, a small and personal example and broadening it out to entire communities, and to start to talk about the work that she does. Um, and then her call to arms is obviously a call to arms more for folks to join her movement or to donate or their time or their money, which is very different from the health profession school application, I know. But you can kind of feel how there's a crescendo effect of taking something small that a reader can get invested in or have empathy for or see as recognizable, and using that to help somebody understand why she is interested in and passionate about a much broader issue for a much larger group of people. Now, one thing I didn't talk to you about is how she incorporates the challenge, choice, and outcome model. And the way that she weaves that into her story is by talking about, as she grew older and came to this realization, she experienced a lot of anger related to her observation of personal inequality, and how that led her to a few run-ins with the law, and to to kind of some challenges in her life that created further barriers for her. And she talked about how because of that, she was given a choice to go live with a relative in another state for a while, and how that relative was passionate about gardening, and how at various points during her stay with that relative, she was over and over again given choices for punishment or for working in the garden, and um, how eventually choosing to work outside and work in a garden became a healing process for her and helped her to reclaim space. And again, you can see how, and for her, the personal outcome was deciding to change her life. But you can then see how that is a much more, I tell it as a separate part of the story because I think it really deepens what could be, while still really moving as a story, a much less kind of complicated or detailed journey. If you had just known about her experience as a child and then some broader information about how that informed her perspective on communities that she worked with. Now, not everyone has a story that is as dramatic as that writer's, but I think that what I would hope you would take away from a story like that is to dig really, really deep in terms of your motivations for a career in healthcare, and to try to present as personal and um, as realistic and as sort of complicated and thoughtful a presentation of that as possible. What we're trying to avoid is what we call the common the common personal statement. I've always wanted to be a doctor. Here, I want to help people. I'm curious. I want to solve problems. Here's why I believe that medicine is a place for me to do all of those things. Please accept me to your medical school. And if you are panicking hearing that, please don't panic. Because I read many personal statements from you guys each year, many of whom start at that place. But I want to encourage you, even if you don't use the story of self model to a T, to take some of the elements away from this to try to understand um, where your motivation came from, and can you bring us into that experience as much as possible to take it from shared characteristics that we all have. We all want to help people. We are all curious. We all want to help solve problems. Otherwise, we'd really be in trouble in heading down this career pathway. But how can you personalize that, complicate it a little bit, tailor it to you and your personal experience in a way that even if those elements are present, someone reading it says, okay, now I know this person and I get where they're coming from, and I can attach this personal experience to them in a way that is not at high risk of being considered identical to other people's experiences, stories, or what they might be writing in their personal statements. Okay, so we have a little over 5 minutes left to just run through any questions that you guys might have. And like I said, this is just designed to be a very brief introduction to the model to get you thinking about it. I know several of you are kind of thinking about what may go in your personal statement, and the last thing we want to do is to have you come to the summit in April not having thought about this or not having a framework to start to think through it on your own in a structured way. So this is a lot of getting information, and we will have lots of chances to practice that. But with that, can I answer any questions tonight? Okay. And just in case anyone is having technical difficulties, I just unmuted everyone. So apologies if there's any background noise, but I'll do one more call for questions with everybody unmuted. Okay. If I could leave you with a parting thought, if you're wondering how in the world you're going to incorporate this, just keep asking the question why. And you can start with where you are now and why you did MedServ, and then go backwards and try to chase down that thread of why you did things. And somewhere at the end of that chain, maybe something, or maybe very close, but it doesn't have to be kind of a childhood or young story. It could be at any point along the line, but get you to that root cause place of where did this interest really come from, and where can I tell a really strong story about why I have ended up with this crazy application for this crazy process that I'm signing up for. And with that, I want to thank everybody for your time. Happy Tuesday. And I hope you are all having great times in your clinic. Please feel free to reach out to me if you are really actively working on your personal statement and you're trying to work all this stuff out. I also wanted to let you know that the next quarterly, you'll have the option, depending on when you are working on a personal statement, to skip either this, the next reflective writing piece, or the one in the summer that's usually due around June. So I'm happy to read personal statements, and I offer that to all our fellows every year in lieu of a reflective writing piece. And yeah, I wish you the best of luck in that process. And it's good to see your names on a screen and at least get to talk at you.
Thanks, Anne.
Yeah, have a good night, guys.
Thanks, Anne.
Thank you. You too.